Greetings. My name is Kate Rademacher, and I'm delighted to be here with Dr. Frank Rogers Jr. Frank is an author and a researcher and does many interesting and wonderful things. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Before we get started, we are going to be talking about Frank's newest book, and it does have some sensitive content in it, including a discussion of childhood sexual trauma. So for those who might just be with sensitive listeners, just wanted to give you some alerts around that. And the title of Frank's new book is Cradled in the Arms of Compassion, A Spiritual Journey from Trauma to Recovery. So Frank, thank you so much for joining us. And thank you for this book. As I was telling you before we started, this is a difficult topic and it was hard to read at times, but I'm still working my way through the book. Was blessed to get an advanced reader copy. It's really impacting me. And I've had a number of important discussions with family members and colleagues since reading it. So I thank you for the conversations it's already sparking. But before we talk about the specifics of your book, could you please just tell us about your background, just tell us about your professional life and a little bit about your writing life. Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Kate. It's an honor to be here, and I'm really grateful. So thank you. It's a delight to have this conversation. I'm a professor of spiritual formation and narrative pedagogy at the Claremont School of Theology. We're an interreligious, progressive school of theology, and I also co-founded and co-direct the Center for Engaged Compassion. So a lot of my research is in spiritual formation that is contemplative and creative and socially liberative. I've written several books. I used to work with under-resourced teenagers using narrative, storytelling, and spiritual autobiography and playmaking as a source for personal empowerment and kind of telling the truth in our own stories within our communities, and wrote a book about that work called Finding God in the Graffiti. And then I wrote a novel that actually is a fictionalized account of my own spiritual journey and recovery from sexual abuse, and then written a couple of books on compassion and the work that we do at the Center for Engaged Compassion.
Thank you for that. And I know the word compassion is in the title of your newest book. And so can you tell us about your newest book and what does that book really address? And how is it perhaps different from your other books? So thanks.
Yeah, right. Well, it's a very personal book. It's really a spiritual autobiography of my own journey. I am a survivor of child sexual abuse, and this it kind of erupted in my young 30s when I had my child, and some of the interactions that happened, and all of a sudden I was just inundated with nightmares and hallucinations and rages and despairs and self-loathing, and started cutting and ended up in a mental institution, which really started a several decade psycho-spiritual quest to find resources to heal, both psychologically, just to be able to regulate myself and kind of come to terms with the trauma. This was before trauma therapy was such an important part of our cultural landscape as it is right now. But it was also a spiritual journey in that I was looking for spiritual resources that cultivated resilience and hope and purpose out of the midst of suffering, and also that would connect me with a sacred source that would bring healing. And I discovered that source as a sacred presence of compassion. So I went on a long journey, but I didn't really think about writing a book until just a few years ago when my young sister, Linda, she was 49 and a homemaker up in the rural redwood country outside of Eureka. And out of the blue, she started being hounded by nightmares and hallucinations and flashbacks. She herself started to self-lacerate and thought everybody was violating her, really got a distorted sense of what was happening, and ended up in a mental institution. And the only person in the world at that point she could trust was me, and invited me to come up and be with her. And in the course of that time with her, she asked me, Frank, you were like this yourself, a couple decades ago, and you're not like that anymore. What did you do to get better? And And at that point, she was still emaciated and just wrecked with trauma. And I just said, Linda, I got good help, and we'll get you good help, and that's we're going to find that we'll go through this together. And about 4 weeks later, she took her own life, and that just gut punched me. And so out of my own coming to terms with the grief of that, um, um, came to the realization that I needed to write a book for her. I needed to answer her question. And so the book is really my response. This is the story of my journey, the horrors and traumas of sexual violation, and what I did to get better, the practices I found, the resources I found. And so it's a healing and redemptive journey, but it goes through the abyss to find the life on the other side.
Well, thank you for that. And what it is, it's as I think I, used this word previously, it was just harrowing to read what you and other members of your family went through and just the intergenerational trauma that really, stands out. And so and I'm so sorry deeply about this loss of your sister. And also, I'm grateful that you're doing this work in part to honor her memory and her question to you. You mentioned, how much the landscape has changed around trauma informed interventions, and I think that I agree with you. And I think that it's such it's amazing to see how much work is being done sort of around trauma informed interventions. And so, I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about sort of in your own book what you found to be useful, what you discuss in your book, sort of the practices and some of the examples you just mentioned of sort of what your journey your to healing and included. And then also if you have any comments about sort of the broader landscape and sort of trauma informed interventions more broadly. Thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you for that. Yeah, well, this journey for me started in the 1980s and 1990s. When there wasn't that much work on trauma. I mean, Judith Herman's landmark book, Trauma and Recovery, didn't come out till 1992, and also child sexual abuse was just not on our radar either. The Courage to Heal by Ellen Bass and Laura Davis, and then Mike Blue's work came out in the late 1980s. And so I kind of felt like I was swimming in the dark. I mean, I was just kind of looking for resources and, various forms of therapies and spiritual practices. And it really, for me, it was a constellation of things. And I kind of synthesized that at the very end of the book, sort of like on the other side of the journey, all the various things that kind of helped me in that. But I would say I would lift up for me, the most important one was when I began to discover that I could trust my emotions and trust what my body was telling me. I grew up in a Christian spiritual tradition, raised Catholic, that really kind of demonized our emotions and demonized the body and maligned it, and kind of these notions of original sin, that we've got suspicious evilness and sordidness woven into us. Kind of created this cauldron within me, that when I started going through all of these internal cacophonies of rage and self-laceration and shame and despairs, I demonized those. I mean, this just was proof of how awful I was, and what a depraved human being, that I would be thinking these thoughts and having these images in me, and my body would be recoiling at touch, and what was wrong with me. And the fundamental turn was when I was able to, through the help of therapists and companions that helped me along this way, recognize that what I feel for a reason. The way my body responds to things, it responds for a reason. We aren't born that way. So there is some kind of suffering, some kind of trauma that gives rise to these different emotions and impulses and sensations. And when that move happened, it enabled me then to say, okay, so let me turn to those rages or those impulses and attend to them with curiosity and even with some compassion. What is the pain underneath here? What is the wound that you're trying to bring to the light of day? What are you needing? What type of protection are you trying to offer me? And what danger are you alerting me to, that I can tend with compassion and regulate, and then have a more grounded sense of what was going on around me, and able to really tend and heal the wounds within me. And And that involved a really kind of a meditative practice of befriending my emotions, and engaging them to surface the wounds within them, and then healing of memories. I mean, really kind of being with the wounded children inside of me and inviting the sacred presence to be with those wounded ones within me as well. That not only re-regulated me, but it was profoundly healing and accessed the kind of vitality and purpose that I could live my life out of. And that kind of imaginative, meditative practice of self-compassion and really befriending our internal states was pivotal in my own healing and recovery journey. And this book really is a thick description of what that looks like in the course of recovering from trauma. And as you say, now we've got this great resources of trauma informed care that has really exploded, and it is outstanding. I think every organization, every faith community needs to be trauma informed. Bessel van der Kolk's work, "The Body Keeps the Score," is landmark in explaining why people who survive trauma are wired the way that we are, and the kinds of deep healing that are essential in the midst of that, including things like internal family systems therapy, which I'm now a trained certified practitioner in, that is this profoundly non-pathologizing, trauma-sensitive way of healing our inner wounds. And we have so many wonderful resources. It's a great gift to all of us who are suffering. And we all suffer from trauma of one kind or another. So these are resources that we all can use.
Thank you for that. And I appreciate especially your last point about sort of we're all impacted by trauma. And, 3 or 4 years ago, I might not, I don't know, I might not, I mean, I'm not sure if I would have agreed, but now I 100% agree. I just think we've all been through a lot globally in the past several years. And I think there have been multiple traumas for many people. And so I think what you're saying can resonate for more people perhaps than even a few years ago. Um, so I just want to go back to, I have some conceptual questions I want to ask you in a minute, but before that, as you were talking, was thinking about the opening chapter of your book, which has a lot going on. A lot happens in the opening, and so I don't know if you want to summarize it for us, but perhaps you could just tell a little bit about how you opened the book and why you made that choice. Because I've been wondering that because I also know that later you sort of explore how you had lost a lot of your memories. So I was curious, like when the knowledge of that day sort of came back to you. And again, maybe I misunderstood the timeline there, but so maybe you can just talk about how you open the book. Thanks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, for me, the opening kind of frames the whole quest that I was the book is describing. I was in Catholic school as a young boy. I think I was 6 or 7 years old, and the book opens in this kind of traumatized moment where I remember looking out the window and seeing my maternal step grandfather driving down the road on his way to our house to come for an extended visit. He is the real predator in our family. You talked about intergenerational trauma. He was the one that, when my mom was 4 or 5, joined the family and severely sexually assaulted her and her 2 sisters from the time my mom was 5 until she left the house at 18. That gave rise to my mom's, severely wounded and challenging ways of trying to survive all of that bled into sexual abuse that she then perpetrated upon me, that I began healing from. And so when I saw him, I just and also he was the man who raped me, and he also raped Linda, my sister. We both suffered that trauma, and that was the PTSD that was erupting within her was the memories of that abuse. So I opened the book kind of with that ancestral presence, who is behind all time for us, coming in, and the dread that I felt right down to my core, that led me to, when recess came, I didn't even want to go into recess. I just decided to walk into a church, to the church building, and sat in the quiet and had one of these profound mystical moments where you can't explain it, but I just sat there and I looked up and saw Mary, who had these eyes of compassion, and for whatever reason, it just cut right to my soul, and I just had this profound sense that I was being cradled in this maternal presence of compassion that understood somehow the terror I had awaiting for me when I was going home, who understood my despairs and my confusion and my feelings of shame, and just held me in an embrace of love. It was a profoundly restorative and mystical moment that actually then was ended and silenced when a priest was in a confessional and walked out and saw me sitting there, and then proceeded to invite me to his own office, where he then sexually assaulted me and completely obliterated this moment of mystical oneness that I had. And from that moment, it kind of frames the exact question: what is real in this world? Was that a real moment? Is the ultimate ground of our world really compassion and connection and a sacred reality that will see us through anything? Or does that get destroyed and violated? And by the severity of tragic abuse over and over again, does that wipe away any sense of the sacredness and compassion within our world? Which is more real? And that became a life or death question for me. And so I was on this search to try to find, in the midst of the trauma and the horror, where is that sacred presence? And is it really healing? And is it really restoring in the midst of even the most horrific of violation and suffering? And the book is detailing that quest.
Well, thanks for that. And I know it's, again, to everyone who's watching and listening in, these are really difficult topics. And Frank, want to thank you for speaking so candidly about them, because again, I think bringing the light into the darkness is so helpful, and you state that really clearly in your I think your little preamble. I want to pivot and ask you about the writing process and the writing journey, because as you know, a lot of our listeners are interested in spiritual writing, faith-informed writing. So can you just talk a little bit about what the process of writing is like for you, and is the writing itself part of your healing journey? And how do you navigate some of the, writing about things that must be very triggering and re-traumatizing perhaps to write about, as you are working through the trauma yourself? So thanks so much.
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. So writing is at the heart of my spiritual practices, to be sure. And for me, it starts with journaling. I'm an incessant journaler, and for whatever reason, from very early on, and I have shelves of my journals. And in fact, this book that I wrote, going back and detailing all the course of my own psycho-spiritual journey, I mean, my journals were my primary research. I mean, I went back and looked at all those different experiences and things that I had tried, and because they had been so thoroughly recorded. And so journaling itself is a spiritual practice for me, just being able to kind of externalize my interior world. Like I said, I felt so consumed and possessed by emotions and memories and impulses, and I could kind of put them on the page and kind of get a little bit of separation from them and process with them. That was hugely important in my own spiritual practice. And along with that, Julia Cameron's The Artist's Way was a huge resource for me, doing the writing pages, the morning pages every day, and just being able to access kind of material that's deep in our depths and surface that and then give us something to work with. So journaling has been extraordinarily important. But then writing itself has also been one of my primary practices. One of the things that I struggled with as an abuse survivor, you alluded to, is I didn't have the memories at the beginning, and so I had these images, and I weren't sure what was true and what was not true, and it made the shame all the more intense. Like, am I making this all up, or did something really happen, and if so, what was it? And it was really through writing that I began to metabolize that. First of all, I realized that, well, you know what? Just the fact that I'm imagining these types of things is itself a form of trauma. So what if I started writing this as fiction? And so let's just dispel with the question of whether it happened in real time or didn't happen. It's the truth of my experience. And I can write a truthful novel that's, about these fictitious circumstances. And so I did. I wrote a novel called The God of Shattered Glass that was really a thinly veiled autobiography of what I was imagining was true in my life, but didn't know for sure the concrete details. And that was enormously helpful in metabolizing the trauma itself and being able to work with, the wounds that were in me as if it had happened, even if I didn't know what really did or didn't happen. But also in the writing of that, I mean, as I was actually creating characters, some of my memories came back, like and as I was doing research, the memories came back. I went back to my childhood home, to, where some of the setting took place. And actually, while I was on a trip there, I walked into the church that I just had spoken about. And it was just remarkable. I walked in, I had no memory of what had happened. And as I walked into the cathedral, my heart just starts pounding and I'm starting to hyperventilate. And it's like, what is going on? I mean, this is, my body was reacting and I was just sitting there just really having a bodily PTSD moment. The memory just came back. Oh my God. That priest walked right out of that confessional. He took me right out that door, and the memory just came flooding back. But it came through the writing and the research for the writing and giving myself permission to create space to let my soul, my unconscious, really be able to express itself, and enormously healing and regenerative.
I'm so glad. And it also sounds like it's, I mean, just your description of your experience walking into the church, it sounds, you use the word you've had good companions on the way. And so again, for those listening, I just want to really, and maybe you can say a word about this, Frank, too, like not doing this work by yourself, because it sounds like, again, maybe perhaps working with somebody with expertise in trauma was important to you. And I can imagine it would be important for others. So I just want to add that for those listening in. So, and my cat is adding some remarks in the background as well. So
Affirming your words. Absolutely.
now,
And I
maybe now we
Yeah,
go
I'm
ahead.
sorry. I just want to say I totally agree. I mean, trauma recovery is a long journey. I mean, it's a long process, and we need supports and companions like gifted therapists and spiritual directors and good friends who are willing to sit there and just say, "Hey, I'm so sorry," and I believe you, and I'll stand with you in the midst of this. I mean, all of that is necessary to be able to really heal and recover from this type of trauma.
Well, and I'm letting my kitty cat come in because this is a difficult topic for all of us. This is bringing up my kitty cat's my therapy animal for this conversation.
Good, good.
I almost lost a really close family member to suicide over during the pandemic, and I'm really again so sorry about the loss of your sister. And um, I'm glad you're telling your story and thank you for it. So, I told you at the beginning that we're thinking about doing a deeper dive in 2024 around the topic of compassion. And so I'm wondering if you could, it sounds like in addition to having all this lived experience and this insight through your writing and your own inner work, you're somewhat of an expert around compassion from a, sort of academic or research perspective. So as I was telling you when we signed on, my Buddhist husband is very, very clear about the definition of compassion, and from his traditional perspective. So from your, my understanding is from your Christian perspective and your perhaps interfaith perspective, how do you define compassion? Perhaps we can start there, and maybe you want to say a bit more, like what is your definition of compassion, and um, how do you see compassion playing out in your own journey, and perhaps including it being included in the title of this book that we're talking about? So thanks.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you for that. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, this is at the heart of my research in the Center for Engaged Compassion and my other writing. I define compassion as being moved in one's depths by the experience of another, and responding with the impulse to nurture flourishing or alleviate suffering. And for me, what's important are several things in that definition. I kind of have an anagram. When I think of compassion, I think our heart beats to the pulse of compassion. When our heart really kind of opens to another, or softens to another, or breaks for another, there's compassion. And so the pulse for me becomes like an acronym to kind of I delineate the different components of compassion. But it starts with being able to really pay attention to another person, to be able to see them in their own reality. We don't often take the time to really see another person in their own experience. We often are kind of seeing people within our own agendas and our own needs, our own impulses, our own reactions. But to really take the time to see, we call this kind of contemplative awareness, kind of that ground, non-judgmental recognition of another person's experience. And then be understanding empathically. It's, all of the sacred languages, words for compassion come from the guts or come from the vital organs. In Greek, like mitsumai, it means intestines. Like we are gut wrenched by another person's suffering. In Arabic and in Hebrew, the word comes from womb, rachachim, where one's womb contracts before another's pain. And in Sanskrit, it comes from heart, one's heart is open, but it's something in our depths, in our vital organs, is actually moved by the suffering or is quickened by the joy that we see in another. And that empathic connection that goes, oh, I get your experience. I understand. I can resonate with that in an attuned kind of a way so that a person feels got, feels seen, feels met, feels known, is instrumental to that compassion. But it's not just that empathic attunement that gives rise to a warm, loving regard towards that other person. It's kind of an energy of just wanting to cradle that person and wrap them in nothing but unconditional love and desiring the best for that person. And that could even be a sacred kind of a sense too, that our own spiritual capacities are heightened, like time stops for a moment and we just have those moments of connection. And it could even be sacred, that the sacred reality, certainly Christians know, is the essence of that is compassion and kind of dwelling in that spiritual connection of loving, warm, loving regard, really kind of is the heart then of compassion. And then we embody that in acts of care and kindness towards another person. So that's kind of how I understand compassion. I mean, there's a lot of pieces in there, but that's kind of the essence for me. And in our work, coming from Christian perspective, one is that our capacities for compassion are grounded in the recognition that there is some sacred source whose essence is compassion, that we find ourselves held in, cradled in, seen by, and that restores us in our own capacities for compassion. That feels really essential to certainly monotheistic understandings of compassion. And the other thing that we really emphasize is that kind of warm, loving regard that really understands and is moved by another's experience can be done to ourselves as well, so that we can extend compassion to the rage within me that is crying out in pain, to really see that, to pay attention to it on its own terms and be moved by its cry and send it a warm, loving regard, being held in a sacred presence that restores the anger in me into a source of resilience, or the wounded parts of me, restores them back into the child that they had lost when they were traumatized. That kind of compassion extended to ourselves is an incredibly important process of personal self-restoration, which then enables us to be able to offer that same kind of a process to another person as well. Does that kind of make sense?
Thank you for that. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
10 years of research.
No, it's really so interesting, very compelling. Thank you. Well, it's time for us to wrap up. So I just want to ask you a little bit about how we can find your newest book, and if we want to learn more about your work, where we can find more about your work. I know that this book came out in October 2023. Is that right? With Lake Drive Books. And our friend and colleague David Morris is a great guy, and so glad to hear that you're working with him. And yeah, so tell us, where can we find the book and where can we learn more about you?
Yeah, thank you. I couldn't be happier than working with David Morris, just a quintessential editor and publisher, really cares about his authors and takes a lot of time with us. So grateful. Yeah, the book is available wherever books are sold. It's on Amazon, and you can find it on Goodreads as well. You can find it on the Lake Drive website as well. And to get a hold of me, you can email me at frogers.cst at csd.edu, or my website is the Center for Engaged Compassion.com. And you can find my resources and the work that we do at the center through that website.
Well, thank you so much. And just to repeat the title of Frank Rogers Jr.'s new book is Cradled in the Arms of Compassion, A Spiritual Journey from Trauma to Recovery. So thanks again for your time and blessings as this book makes its way into the world. And yeah, just wishing you all the best. So thanks again for this conversation.
Thank you, Kate. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate your care and the welcoming presence you've held this conversation in. Very grateful.
Thanks so much. All right, peace. Take care.